Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard here, welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at a new macro lens from Laowa. It is the Laowa 90mm f2.8 2x macro lens. When Laowa told me about this new lens a few weeks ago, my reaction was, why another full frame 2x macro lens? They already have the excellent 100mm f2.8 2x macro lens, which I bought one for myself, and Laowa has released a 85mm f5.6 very compact 2x macro lens not too long ago. So why another 2x macro lens? Well, turns out there are some really good reasons why Laowa create this lens, and let's talk about it in this review. I'll also do some comparison with the Laowa 100mm 2x macro lens and share with you the results as well. Just like most other lenses from Laowa, this new Laowa 90mm f2.8 2x macro lens is a fully mechanical, fully manual lens with no electronic features and contacts. The lens is mostly made of metal and it is slightly heavy at around 620 grams. But at the same time, the lens feels very solid and very well made. The length of this lens is around 12 cm, so it is pretty compact for a full frame 90mm 2x f2.8 macro lens. It is almost 4 cm shorter than the Laowa 100mm 2x macro lens. So one reason why this new lens is a lot more compact is because the Laowa 100mm 2x macro lens was originally designed for DSLR cameras. So the mirrorless camera version, like the Nikon Z version I have here, basically just add an extension tube to make up the difference in the French distance. While this new lens is designed for mirrorless cameras only, it is available for the Canon RF, Nikon Z, Sony E and L mount. Most of this 90mm lens is the big manual focus ring. The focus flow is just a bit over 180 degrees, so it's a pretty long focus flow. And while this is a 2x macro lens, the lens can still focus to infinity, which means you can use it for macro photo, ultra macro photo, as well as normal photos like landscape or portrait. Actually, it could be a very nice portrait lens because of the 90mm focal length and the large f2.8 aperture. The focus ring is buttery smooth and it's quite easy to turn, but it doesn't feel too loose. With my sample, just before it reached the minimum focus distance, the focus ring will suddenly feel not as smooth. It's not really a biggie at all because it only affects the last 2% or so of the focus flow, and maybe it's just because it is a pre-production sample, but it's something that I definitely didn't feel with my Laowa 100mm 2x macro lens. Well, speaking of the Laowa 100mm 2x macro lens, the focus ring on this 100mm lens turn in the opposite direction. So you turn the focus ring counterclockwise to make it focus closer. The focus flow of the 100mm lens is only around 90 degrees and it is more stiff as well. So when I was swapping and comparing between these two Laowa macro lenses, the new 90mm lens definitely feels a lot easier to use and make fine adjustment than the 100mm lens. Anyway, we have the aperture ring near the lens mount, and the aperture ring has clicks and it is 1 click per stop. The maximum aperture is f2.8 and the minimum aperture is f22. It is an internal focus lens and there is a front glass element that stays at and covers the front of the lens, unlike the Laowa 100mm lens which require an additional screw-in front filter to avoid dust from getting into the front of the lens. Unfortunately, it is still not a weather sealed lens, so if you want to take this lens to a rainforest to take some macro photos there, then you have to be careful. One big difference between this Laowa 90mm lens and most other 90 to 100mm macro lens in the market is that this is a 2x macro lens. This makes it a more versatile macro lens as there is quite a big difference between what you can capture at 1x and 2x magnification. When shooting 1x macro photos, the the working distance, which is the distance between the front of the lens and the subject, is around 10 cm. For 2x macro photos, the distance is just under 7 cm. It is really not bad. You have quite a bit of working distance to avoid casting shadow onto your subject, and it's easy for you to use camera flash to light up your subject in many different ways. And if you are taking macro photo of insects, then you don't have to get too close to the insects. Another great thing is that, as I mentioned before, this is an internal focus lens, so when you are changing the focus distance, the length of the lens wouldn't change, so you don't have to worry about the front of the lens would just extend and end up touching the subject when you are focusing. When taking photo at non-macro distance, the center sharpness of this Laowa 90mm macro lens is already very good at f2.8. So stopping down the lens to f4 or f5.6 would only increase the center sharpness marginally. The center sharpness remains excellent until you stop down to around f16 when diffraction starts to reduce the image sharpness noticeably. Comparing it with the Laowa 100mm macro lens, the Laowa 100mm macro lens center sharpness is also very good, but the 90mm macro lens is slightly sharper at the same aperture. Now, if we look at the corner, the 90mm Laowa at f2.8, the corner sharpness is okay, but you can see some noticeable improvement once you stop down to f5.6. The 100mm Laowa macro lens has slightly better corner sharpness. This is especially noticeable at f2.8. Now let's look at the sharpness when taking macro photos. At one-time magnification, the Laowa 90mm macro lens already has excellent center sharpness at f2.8. When stopping down the lens to f4 or even f5.6, the center sharpness only improves very slightly. The center sharpness remains great until around f8, and after that, diffraction will start reduce the sharpness of the lens. At 2x magnification, the center sharpness is also very good at f2.8. Stopping down to f4 gives me some noticeable improvement in sharpness, but to be honest, some of the sharpness improvement may come from the deeper depth of field, which cover some minor error in focusing as the depth of field is just so narrow at f2.8. Sharpness remains very good until f11. Stopping down any further and the center sharpness would start to drop quickly because of diffraction. Comparing it with the Laowa 100mm lens, the Laowa 100mm lens sharpness is also very good at both 1x and 2x magnification. The difference between these two lenses is really small. When shooting at f2.8 with the Laowa 90mm macro lens, bokeh is quite smooth with minimal cat's eye effect near the corner. The edge of the bokeh balls do not have any very noticeable halo ring. When you stop down the lens, bokeh balls remain round even when you stop down to f11 or f16, which is very nice as you have a lot more chance to shoot at small aperture when you are taking macro photos. The Laowa 100mm macro lens has more noticeable cat's eye effect at wide open, but otherwise bokeh from the Laowa 100mm lens is also pretty nice as well. One interesting thing about the Laowa 100mm macro lens is, depending on which lens mount you choose, the aperture braid design will be different, which means the shape of the bokeh ball would be different too when you stop down the lens. With the Laowa 90mm macro lens, it is always 13 braid design, so no matter which lens mount you choose, the bokeh will still look the same. Vignetting is pretty well controlled by this Laowa 90mm macro lens. At the maximum aperture, there is already quite small amount of vignetting even in this plain wall test photo. At f5.6, There is only a small amount of vignetting at the very edge of the photo. So it seems this new Laowa 90mm lens has better vignetting control than the 100mm lens. Look at this side-by-side photo, both shot at f2.8. You can see the difference. The 100mm lens has quite a bit more vignetting. But once you stop down the lens a little bit, the difference in vignetting between these two lenses is not really that noticeable. The Laowa 100mm macro lens has excellent chromatic aberration control, and that sets a benchmark for other similar macro lenses. And this time with the new Laowa 90mm macro lens, it also has excellent chromatic aberration control as well. When I check my photos that has very high contrast, even when I zoom into the photo and do some pixel peeping, I see virtually no color fringing at all, so that is very impressive. My local test result is the same. There isn't any noticeable longitude chromatic aberration. Now let's have a look at distortion. The Laowa 90mm macro lens has pretty minimal amount of distortion. Look at this brick wall test photo. There really isn't any distortion that is noticeable. And if we have a look at the Laowa 100mm macro lens, distortion control is pretty well controlled as well. But in comparison, you can see the 100mm macro lens has a little bit more pincushion distortion. The distortion test photo was shot from the same position, so you can also see the difference in the field of view between these two lenses. Lens flare control is pretty decent with this new Laowa macro lens. Even when shooting directly into the sun, the amount of lens flare and ghosting is still at pretty low level. Contrast remains very good as well. If you look at this side-by-side comparison, you can see a bit of ghosting from the Laowa 90mm lens, but it's not serious at all. The Laowa 100mm lens appears to have a bit more ghosting than the Laowa 90mm lens. Okay, now let's have a look at Sunstars. With this new Laowa 90mm macro lens, you need to stop down the lens to around f11 for the Sunstars to become visible in your photo. At the minimum aperture f22, Sunstars look reasonably sharp, but probably this is not the best looking Sunstars from a Laowa lens. The Sunstars from the Laowa 100mm macro lens is not really quite as sharp, and as I've mentioned before, the Laowa 100mm lens has different aperture braid design, depends on which lens mount you choose. So the Sunstars would look very different if you have the Nikon F mount or the Canon EF mount, which has 7 and 9 aperture braids instead. Okay, it's the final part of this review. So why Laowa create this 90mm macro lens? Look at the image quality. I think it's quite clear this lens image quality is fantastic. It can easily match the excellent Laowa 100mm macro lens. Actually, not just match, but a little bit better in quite a few areas as well. But that's not just it. The lens is also quite a bit smaller, and it has a few improvements in the design as well. So if you are choosing between this new lens and the older 100mm macro lens, as long as you are not planning to shoot with a DSLR camera, I would definitely recommend you to choose this new Laowa 90mm lens instead. The Laowa 100mm 2x macro lens is already a really nice lens, or else I wouldn't buy one for myself. But this 90mm 2x macro lens is just a better lens overall. But don't forget that Laowa also has released the 85mm f5.6 2x macro lens very recently, which is an even smaller and lighter lens with similar optical performance. So if you want a very compact 2x macro lens and don't need the f2.8 maximum aperture, then the Laowa 85mm macro lens could be a great choice for you as well. Remember to check out my review of the Laowa 85mm 2x macro lens if you haven't watched it already.